And now for a more in-depth look at the late leader's life and achievements, RT's Al Gurnov speaks to Naina Yeltsina, the widow of Russia's first president. That's in our interview program, Spotlight, coming up next on RT.
Hello again and welcome to Spotlight, the interview show on RT. I'm Al Gurnov and today's show is a dedication to the first president of Russia, the late Boris Yeltsin. He would have been 80 today, and this would have been one of those rare days that he'd spent together with his family and his wife, Naina. She never really tried to play First Lady, and their relations were always away from the media spotlight. Today, Naina Yeltsina is my guest on the Spotlight, a dedication to the great love of her life.
The charismatic President Yeltsin became the icon of the new Russia, which emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Empire. He saw people adoring him in the early 90s and became less popular in his late presidency. Boris Yeltsin set the media free, and the media paid him back badly, never missing a chance to sting him. But Yeltsin knew he had the power to go through everything until his wife Naina was near.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Yeltsina, and thank you for being with us on this show. Today, as we commemorate Boris Yeltsin, I'd like to ask you, do you remember the day when your husband came home as president?
Do you remember the late 1980s and the early 1990s? Russia was boiling. Everyone was strongly politicized and wished changes. Boris Yeltsin was one of the most prominent figures at the time. He participated in rallies. He too looked forward to changes. In the first place, that was something he began with. His original pronouncements were about the need for this country to live differently. And then there came the first elections, when hundreds of thousands of people attended rallies all over the country. On the election day, we were at home because we had voted early in the morning. Later in the day, he had a meeting with his support team and some other meetings. In the evening, when the vote count began, we were, of course, anxiously watching the returns come in. It goes without saying that we wanted to win.
You mean you were having tea at home and watching TV?
At the end of the day, when it became clear that the majority, as the count showed, was for Boris Yeltsin, and that he was winning in the first round, we were, of course, very happy. Late at night, we had a little impromptu celebration. It was quite an emotional moment. The tension was immense, and we were all uptight, not knowing how things would shape up. There were so many commissions at all polling stations, watching that the ballot should unfold the right way. You should remember those days.
Absolutely, and Yeltsin won with an overwhelming edge.
Of course, all those commissions represented the communists, because Boris Yeltsin had practically nobody to monitor the process. But in the morning, it was already clear that he had won in the first round. So he just left for his office as usual.
And from that time on, the family didn't see a lot of him, did you?
No, we didn't. There was only work. We met on Sundays.
Raisa Gorbacheva introduced the institution of First Lady in this country. She was the first president's wife to start making public appearances. She became a public person. Why didn't you take that role upon yourself? Why has the institution as such failed to take root in Russia? Did you ever think about that?
No, I never thought about that. I just behaved the way I believed I should. If some official functions were held, I was present. If there were none, I wasn't present. If I had to attend some events alone, when, for example, foreign presidents with wives were paying a visit to this country, I did that. Sometimes I accompanied them on various trips to some of Russia's provinces. Most of the events, though, were here in Moscow. We visited hospitals, schools, orphanages, various centers. And on the whole, I tried to act naturally, because I had had no special schooling.
Do you think it is inevitable that people praise a leader when he is on top, and then pour torrents of filth on him after he steps down? Is it some sort of compensation, or balance maybe? What do you think? Or does reviling prevail over praise?
You know, it's not praise that I'm looking for. I'm not saying Yeltsin should be praised. Personally, I don't enjoy that. Listen, we lived more than 50 years in Sverdlovsk. He was head of the Sverdlovsk region, and there was nothing of the kind there. Nothing at all. We didn't permit ourselves anything that would invite this sort of massive abuse. I mean, we lived like all normal people, and there was no problem with that. But then we came here, and it all began. As early as 1987, and the trial persisted into his presidency. This is why it was very hard to accept this torrent of injustice right away. And I knew very well
that things will end up this way.
No, not that they will end up this way, but that it was a difficult period. The Yeltsin presidency was a very difficult and trying period. I was well aware that people, too, were having it the hard way. Their life was a very difficult one.
You've just said an amazing thing. You said there was the period of presidency in Yeltsin's life. For me and for other people all over the world, Yeltsin means the first president of Russia. To ordinary people, Yeltsin was president and nobody else, while to you it is but a small period, an episode in his life. Is this how you see it?
No, of course not. I think it was an enormous period. It went fast, but it eclipsed everything else. Those were tremendously stressful years. Besides, 9 years is a significant period by any measure. Well, it was a stressful time ever since we moved to Moscow in 1985.
What do you personally think was the most important thing that Yeltsin accomplished in his life?
Well, for me personally, and for all our family, and for all Russian people, I think, he did the most important thing. He gave people freedom.
You have no doubts about that. This is the most important thing to you.
No, I have no doubts. I'm sure that what he did can never be reversed. This country's past cannot be brought back, ever.
You say he gave people freedom. That is true. But then, the advent of free market made millions of people poor. The free press brought quite a lot of painful critique on him, and you mentioned that. Has there ever been any regret about that freedom that he gave to people?
Do you remember in what economic situation the country was in the late 1980s? I mean 1987, 88, 89?
It was critical.
It was a time when there were ration cards and when there was nothing at all in stores, and more importantly, there was nothing left to stock them up. When he became president in 1991, what did he have to do? Sit and wait for riots to begin? I remember very well when President Mitterrand came with a visit in 1991, and then Chancellor Kohl came later. They both said the same thing. No, actually Mitterrand said that in 1995, when he came to Russia to attend the V-Day celebrations. He was already very ill at the time. We had a long conversation and he said, "You know, I came here because of your husband. I think Mr. President did everything possible to save people, not only in Russia, but also in Europe and the whole world." He said, "We," he meant Europe, I guess, had stopped giving money to Gorbachev by the time Yeltsin started challenging him. And Chancellor Kohl said exactly the same thing. He said that the USSR was not repaying any loans. So Mitterrand said, "Can you imagine what it would have been if famine broke out in such a multinational country as yours? It would have been much worse than Yugoslavia."
They were afraid there would be a war.
No, they were sure of that. And we are a nuclear power. And by containing all that, in Mr. Mitterrand's words, Boris Yeltsin not only saved Russia, but also Europe and the world.
Says Naina Yeltsina. Spotlight will be back shortly. We will continue this interview in less than a minute, so stay with us, don't go.
This is not a theatrical set. This is a real correctional facility. But is there any cultural life behind bars? Could art transform a criminal into a law-abiding citizen? And can performance really revolutionize the penitentiary system? Prison Theatre on RT.
Wings, special outfit and accessory equipment. And they are ready for free flight. Taken off once, the air became their gravity. Is it true that those people were birds in their previous life?
Flying high, you know how I feel.
And what is so magnetic in a free flight?
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm Algorinov, and just a reminder that my guest on the show today is Naina Yeltsina, the widow of the late Russian president, Boris Yeltsin.
Mrs. Yeltsina, your husband ascended the political summit swiftly, and I witnessed that unique ascension. After that, however, his popularity began to fall. Prior to that, there was no such tradition in Russia to evaluate popularity. But now this was happening before our eyes. The approval rating was falling. The free press, which Yeltsin himself created, began to attack him and his family. Did he personally feel hurt? Was he offended? How did he react?
He was an intelligent and wise person, and a real statesman. He knew that old saying, that the biggest curse is to live at the time of reforms.
Especially if you yourself launched the change.
Right, and he was well aware of what he was risking. Igor Gaidar was much criticized too for what was called shock therapy. However, due to the shortage of food, those measures were inevitable. Today, some say they should have done it gradually. But how can a starving person wait for 6 months to be fed? Urgent measures had to be taken, which meant shock therapy. Perhaps there could have been a better name for that therapy, but essentially the task was to radically change the situation in the country over a short period of time. I remember Boris Yeltsin met the head of his cabinet and they had a very long conversation. Gaidar was a top expert on economics and he explained the situation to Yeltsin very clearly. Boris Yeltsin himself was very competent in economic affairs and he understood Gaidar perfectly. That's why he made the decision that transition to market economy was the only possible way. And today we see he was right. As for the way it was carried out, not gradually but at once, well, look at the result. The country did go through this and survived. And by 1993, the market was being filled with products. And when Boris Yeltsin handed over the country to Vladimir Putin, our market was nearly the same as in Europe, with everything, from supermarkets to boutiques. In a word, Russia had become a European country.
Well, now, let's take a look at the years of Boris Yeltsin's presidency in a report now by Spotlight's Yelena Demidova.
If you Google for Boris Yeltsin, the first videos you'll get are what's called his funny moments. Laughing, dancing, trying to conduct an orchestra, doing other things none of his predecessors had ever done. His eccentric behavior went down in history, but that's just a tiny part of a complex personality who brought so much change to his country. From the very beginning of Yeltsin's political career, his image was far from that of a typical Soviet bureaucrat. Mingling with the crowd was his normal practice. In 1991, he became the first popularly elected president of the Russian Federation. 2 months later, amid a coup by a group of communist hardliners, he urged people to defend democracy.
Thus, we declare illegal all the decisions and decrees by the State of Emergency Committee.
Yeltsin issued a ban on the Communist Party, which added to the euphoria of the freedom of the time. However, this was followed by a much less popular decision to dissolve the USSR. And the real blow to Yeltsin's popularity was the economic reforms of the 1990s, labeled shock therapy. 1993 saw violent confrontation when Yeltsin eventually made a decision to shell the Russian White House. The new constitution adopted afterwards would give more power to the president. Yeltsin received support from world leaders. Russia's relations with the EU and the US improved greatly.
He stood up for freedom and democracy and openness. He really believed that Russia couldn't go back to communism or back further to extreme nationalism.
What the West could never forgive Yeltsin for, though, was war in Chechnya. In 1994, Moscow sent troops there in an attempt to restore control over the territory. In 1996, Yeltsin energetically campaigned for his second term and was re-elected, though the vote was not so much for him but mostly against his communist opposition. Yeltsin's second term was marred by serious health problems and erratic behavior. In 1999, he chose his successor and announced his resignation.
You said Boris Yeltsin was a wise politician. He outwitted many in politics, including Gorbachev. However, is it true that his political moves were based mostly on intuition, or did he consider his every move thoroughly? You know how he made decisions better than anybody.
You know,
was he like a chess master or not?
I can't call him unpredictable. He never acted on the spur of the moment. Of course, there may have been some situation where he had to act quickly.
But was he impulsive?
He would always think through all his moves, and his intuition was outstanding. He had gone through good training.
You mean the Soviet political system?
No. For nearly 10 years he was in charge of the major industrial region of Sverdlovsk, the second or the third in the Soviet Union in terms of industrial output, which means a lot. During that time, the region invariably achieved good results, which also means a lot. He had to make very serious decisions, and he never made any mistakes during that time. The Regional Executive Committee chairman often asked me, "Take good care of Boris," because he said there had never been a single case where he would make a bad decision. That too means a lot.
So his reputation of an impulsive politician is false.
He was a very serious and thoughtful person. Each time he had to make an important decision, he would sound out other people without telling them about his own position. He had his ways of doing that.
Did he often take other people's advice?
He would always discuss his decisions, both in Sverdlovsk and in Moscow, with his team. And he had a very good team, with Yegor Gaidar, Viktor Chernomyrdin, Alexander Voloshin, Anatoly Chubais. They were all on the team, and many others. Some of them are still working. They often had very heated discussions, and Boris Yeltsin would always hear out everyone. Of course, sometimes if he was convinced that his decision was good, and if he managed to persuade his team, he made executive decisions. But those decisions, of course, were not made on the spur of the moment.
On December 31st, 1999, Boris Yeltsin addressed the Russian people on television and said he wanted Russia to enter the new millennium with a new president. In fact, he was mistaken, because the new millennium did not start until a year later. Anyway, was it an emotional move on his part when he mentioned the new millennium? Or was it all part of a big political game, maybe? Handing over the authority and all that.
At any rate, the year 2000 was considered a landmark in a way. The beginning of a new era. And of course, the new millennium was not far away. So it was a nice way to do it. His biggest concern, though, was that the election should take place in a calm atmosphere. That's what he was thinking about. So he wanted the person he endorsed to be elected without turmoil. And when he chose Vladimir Putin, he first appointed him Prime Minister, and people came to know and understand Putin. Once Boris Yeltsin saw that Putin was becoming popular with people, he stepped down.
So that decision was not impulsive either?
No, everything had been thoroughly considered.
After he resigned, we didn't see much of him. He spent most of the time here in this house. Did he change much after his resignation? What did you all do?
He did not change at all. How can a person change? He never changed. He didn't change when he became president, and he didn't change after he resigned. As to what he did, his lifestyle was pretty active. We traveled a lot around Russia and abroad. For example, we went on fishing trips to Norway and Iceland. It was fun when Chirac invited us to stay in Nice for a week.
So you traveled?
We did. Of course, we'd also traveled much during his presidency, but at that time he could only see the world through the window of his car, as those were official visits.
My next question may sound odd, but are you glad that he was able to spend his last years with you and not in the Kremlin?
Of course. All of us in the family were so happy. When not on a trip, he was always with me. He spent time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. All enjoyed being with him. It was interesting to talk to him and just spend time with him. He knew how to make people happy. We would go fishing together, for example.
Is it true that after his resignation, he lost half of those whom he had considered his friends?
Absolutely not. All the friends who had been with him during his presidency remained with him. Even today, his friends stay in touch with me.
Mrs. Yeltsina, you look very well. Your eyes are kind and bright. Does that mean you're happy?
I can't really say I'm happy today, because my husband is not with me. But I'm a happy person because I have wonderful daughters, wonderful sons-in-law, wonderful grandchildren and great-grandchildren. All these things naturally make me happy, and I have to hold on for the sake of my children and for the memory of Boris Yeltsin. As long as I live, the memory of him is quite different, because he and myself are one. As for me, I consider myself happy, of course, because for more than 50 years I lived with Boris Yeltsin, with this outstanding, extraordinary, wonderful person.
Спасибо большое. Thank you very much for being with us. And just a reminder that my guest on the show today was Naina Yeltsina, widow of the late Russian President Boris Yeltsin. And that's it for now for all of us here. We'll be back with more. Until then, stay on Russia Today and take care.